Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast as we're introducing a new segment here. We're going to continue to revise it as we go on here, but NFL Weekly Awards. Now we're going to be talking about the biggest games, the biggest statements from teams, the worst losses, and along those lines. So if you have any suggestions as to what types of superlatives you would like to see us come out with, definitely be sure to use the comment section and let us know there. But starting off here, the best game of the week, in my opinion, was the Kansas City Chiefs versus the Cincinnati Bengals. Like we just talked about in the last segment, I know that a lot of people are sort of trying to write off the Bengals. The fact that they were 6.5-point underdogs coming into this game, I think was very disrespectful, and ultimately they showed that they still can hang with the best of them. Now, ultimately, they fall here, so I don't want to give them too much praise, but this is a very possible playoff matchup later this year. Now, it feels like we got robbed a little bit because of the defensive pass interference penalty. Would have been just a lot more fun aesthetically if ultimately the Chiefs were able to pick up that fourth down conversion without a penalty, but got to be more disciplined on the Cincinnati side of things there. So, either way, I think that this game had a little bit of everything. We didn't even get Patrick Mahomes versus Joe Burrow at their peaks, really. I thought that, Burrow did ultimately play pretty well in this game outside of the fumble 6 that occurred, but I do think that ultimately speaking here, he played pretty well. Patrick Mahomes left some to be desired. I believe that I heard that this was the lowest amount of points lowest total amount of yards that Patrick Mahomes has had when he's played a full game. So Bengals may have sort of discovered something there in terms of what type of competition they can sort of stand against the Chiefs, but ultimately I think that this was a pretty good performance, all things considered. It was a fun game, a lot of late game dramatics there, and what would the NFL be without a little bit of controversy? So I do think that this was the best game, although last night's Monday Night Football game between the Atlanta Falcons and the Philadelphia Eagles also would rival that. And we're not doing a worse game here, but oh my God, that Bengals-Texans game would 100% be there. And maybe that's a superlative that we add in moving forward here. But the best win of the week, I think, was the New Orleans Saints over the Dallas Cowboys. The Saints blew the doors off of the Carolina Panthers in week 1. Derek Carr looked really good in that game, and that was exciting. But as we've clearly learned, especially with this week 2 in the books, that it's hard to put much stock into any sort of a performance against the Carolina Panthers. So the Saints still had a number of questions going into Jerry World, where the Saints offense especially was lights out last season up until their playoff game against the Packers. But this was a huge statement win for the Saints, that they are to be taken seriously. Now, the consistency with the Saints is sort of what we're waiting on. They still won 9 games last year, but they had a lot of high highs and a lot of low lows. So ultimately, they are going to need to continue to prove it. They have a game upcoming this week against the Philadelphia Eagles at home that I think should be an excellent game, and they can continue to prove themselves. But again, for the offense to continue to sort of dominate through 2 weeks, 40-plus points in each of the first 2 games of the season, I think that is a great sign moving forward here. Clint Kubiak obviously getting all of his flowers right now, but we're just going to need to see it happen a little bit more consistently for the Saints. But I thought this was an excellent win. I would also give as an honorable mention the Arizona Cardinals just laying the Los Angeles Rams out in that game, blowing them out. Kyler Murray looking excellent. Marvin Harrison Jr. exploding. I thought that ultimately the Cardinals were also in that conversation, but I also think that the Saints are very depleted at this moment. Cowboys are more seen, at least in my eyes, as a team that could be a playoff threat, so I'm giving it to the Saints. the worst loss, Jacksonville Jaguars, and I think this one should be pretty consensus. What an awful game from the Jaguars. And this is from somebody who has been a believer that the Jaguars made the right decision in deciding to pay Trevor Lawrence and that their defense was going to take steps forward this year. Doug Peterson was going to be able to bounce back, and sort of none of those things really, checked off in this past game. Now, defense, I'm still not out on them. I thought they played okay, but they were also facing Deshaun Watson. But to lose a game where the Browns, I believe, were 3 of 12. I can double check here. I think it was 3 of 12 on third down conversions. It was 2 of 14, so even worse. And 13 penalties for in this game for double checking here actually my notes, but it was so sloppy really on both sides of this game. In the loss, it was the Browns who had 13 penalties for 100 yards, and they still end up winning this game. It is, a real indictment on where the Jaguars are at. If you really want to be an apologist, you can talk about the fact that it was pouring and offenses might not have been good on either side here, but even some of the general decision making with Trevor Lawrence was very much lackluster, and I am sufficiently disappointed to say the least. But would also throw the Eagles in probably as another honorable mention, considering the fact that they blew the game in the fashion that they did, but they still, sort of outperformed the Falcons for the majority of the game. Jaguars were just a mess, pretty much from start to finish, so they get marked down here as my worst loss. The best individual performance, I have Alvin Kamara. And to see him have this sort of, possible rejuvenation is really fun to see. Kamara is somebody who has had a very weird career arc, and I don't know if he's necessarily gotten the love publicly overall throughout his career for what a star he's been, but he was just on one in this game. On the ground, it was 20 carries for 115 yards and 3 touchdowns. Add to that his 2 receptions for 65 yards and a touchdown. Kamara was incredible altogether, and if the Saints are going to be a prominent force in the NFL this season, it's going to have to be the balance. Derek Carr has looked excellent, but I don't think it can solely be the Derek Carr show. The balance that Kamara provides as well on the ground. I think that the Saints offensive line as well definitely deserves some credit as well. Not a lot of people out there are big offensive lineman fans, but their 2 tackles in Taliesin Fuaga and Trevor Penning, I just think that they have a nastiness to them where they just get out and move people, and I'm very encouraged by what I've seen from the Saints. Now, I don't really have an offensive honorable mention here, but what I would say is I might add Defensive Player of the Week into this category as well, which would easily have to be Aiden Hutchinson with his 4.5 sacks. So if that's something that you think that we should include in these NFL awards, weekly awards, I should say, let us know in the comments section. But finally, the biggest red flag that I saw from this past week is the Philadelphia Eagles coaching staff, I should say. And ultimately, I don't want to kick a dead horse here. Everybody is slaughtering the Eagles coaching staff right now, but it's just the reality of the situation as well, that they sort of handed that game to the Atlanta Falcons in a couple different ways. And I talked about this in the game breakdown, that offensive coordinator Kellen Moore, I thought, had a tough game. Vic Fangio, the defensive coordinator, didn't put together a great game plan. And then obviously the decision making at the end of the game is really what sort of steals all the headlines here. But just all in all, the Eagles are a talented team, but they have to be able to get out of their own way. And that's what we didn't see. We didn't see them do that last season. And now, it's just really disappointing to see this happen in this game as well, where they're going to be under the microscope for this upcoming season. Last season they basically chalked it up to both of our coordinators last year weren't good. So, okay, you move on from them. You bring in 2 new coordinators. Now is where Nick Sirianni's back is against the wall. And even if he is sort of a locker room guy and, fires up the Eagles players, you gotta be more well composed as a team as a whole, and that I do not think that they were in that collapse loss to the Falcons. But another red flag that I would throw in there as well of an honorable mention is the Ravens passing defense, allowing Gardner Minshew to be basically flawless in the second half. That is a very bad sign. The Raiders got nothing done on the ground. I'm a big fan of a lot of players on that Ravens front seven, and I think that they should be, all things considered, pretty good in that secondary. Nate Wiggins not in for this game. I don't know how much he is a transformative talent in year one and how much you can really rely on him to fully pull it together. I understand you're playing Devontae Adams, who is still one of the best wide receivers in the NFL, but Gardner Minshew in that Raiders quarterback room is one of the worst in the NFL. And Gardner played okay, so I don't want to, kill him in a moment where the Raiders actually looked pretty good, all things considered, and Gardner looked pretty good. But, that being said, we can acknowledge that it was great for the Raiders. That's not a team that the Ravens should allow to throw all over them the way they did. But again, sort of first rendition here of the weekly NFL awards. Let me know what sorts of awards you think we should be handing out. But we are now going to move on here. And when we come back on the other side, we're going to be discussing some of the top fantasy football stars that suffered serious injuries this past weekend, talking about what the timeline appears to be at this current moment and what implications it may have on your fantasy football league. So we are going to be diving into all of that, but before we do so, we're going to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.